All right, so we were discussing how gender becomes seen as, quote, real. And we mentioned that gender is acquired through this process of socialization, right? Practically every human interaction in one person's life, right? In the words of a sociologist who looks at gender, quote unquote, people do gender, right? And we mentioned last time that even infants, even before they're born, are treated in gender terms by everyone around them. And then once they are indeed born in the hospital, they're still, of course, treated in gender terms by everyone around them, hospital staff, doctors, family, friends, what have you. Okay, this is doing gender. And then moving on from there, practically every minute of your existence in this world, in human society, you are treated in gender terms, right? And when I say treated, I mean socialization, right? Gender decorum, for example. What is decorum? It's basically what is considered proper in that particular community or society. So, gender decorum includes things like, as I mentioned before, blue is for boys, pink is for girls. And therefore, proper gender decorum is to, have girls dress in pink and buy them pink dolls, right? And then boys, have their rooms in blue. I mentioned this earlier that in American culture, about a century ago, actually, pink was for boys. Okay, so why this sudden shift, right? Sudden in historical terms, right? To the reverse of that. So moving on from infant the infant lives to them becoming boys and girls, young boys and girls. There's still gender decorum happening. There's still that socialization. In other words, of gender, right? Boys play with certain types of toys, so do girls, right? If a boy plays with dolls, girl dolls specifically, right, then it's considered improper. That's not proper gender decorum, right? Certainly their clothing, girls wear dresses, boys don't. By the way, just to show another change in gender decorum for boys and girls, during the 19th century, infants and toddlers, boys wore dresses. Okay? It was just common back then. Now, of course, this had to do also with what was available, to change diapers and what have you. But still, it was not considered bad for toddler boys to wear dresses. Okay. Okay, from there, in everyday relations and interactions, as we've been discussing, everyone is socialized in gendered behavior from a very early age. Gender roles, your clothing, your hairstyles, and people start growing up. Women do gender when they learn to behave properly, like cross their legs when sitting. Why? Because women wear dresses, right? Um, why do they wear dresses for that matter? Because it's proper, right? And then, of course, through the rest of their childhood, you treat boys and girls with proper gender decorum. For example, even in the classroom, teachers often respond differently to boys versus girls, even if they're responding to the same behavior. For example, misbehaving, right? There's sometimes or oftentimes differential treatment here based on gender. So, gender shapes that teacher's response in the class. And then, again, the process of socialization, teens become adults, right? And men and women learn to perform, gender specific activities. Again, your clothing, your hair, style, your behavior, your comportment with others, right? Women are often taught to raise their pinky when drinking from a cup, right? Men don't do that. It's not considered masculine. Believe it or not, even going to a men's room or a women's room in public places is doing gender, okay? We don't do this in private homes, right? There is no gender distinction in private homes, the place where you go to the restroom often, right? Most often. But in public, it is still based on gender. I know there's now gender neutral restrooms and such, but nonetheless, this has been practiced for decades. Okay, so that's just examples of how an individual, regardless of sex, right, is doing gender, and how everyone else in that society that interacts with that individual is doing gender as well. Okay, now an important academic and philosopher, actually, of gender, her name is Judith Butler, and she put forth this notion of gender performativity. Okay, and what does this mean? Basically, it means that gender is not something we are, but something we do. And again, it goes back to we do gender, right? It is produced through these repeated behaviors. Okay, in fact, she called gender, quote, a stylized repetition of acts, right? Remember I said do is a verb, right? So think of action, right? Again, it's produced through repeated behaviors, expressions, interactions. Again, this is all socialization. And it makes gender feel natural or fixed. Okay? A more academic way of saying this is that gender is an ongoing process, social process, in which these repeated acts and norms actually materialize the illusion of a stable identity. Okay? It's an illusion because gender is not fixed, right? And then through these various reiterations, individuals come to be, quote unquote, right? Keyword be. They come to be the genders that they actually enact. And then, of course, society naturalizes them through these patterns, okay, as if they were inherent or natural. Okay, so performativity is that, it's action, it is performed, okay? In fact, here's another quote from Judith Butler, quote, gender is real only to the extent that it is performed, unquote. Okay, so this links with performativity, this idea of performances. And by the way, what does performance include? Wearing makeup, for example, wearing high heels, right? That is, there's no natural connection with wearing makeup and wearing high heels to one's sex, okay? In other words, it's easy to imagine other societies in world history, or even today, where wearing high heels is not seen as natural, right? It's just something that was created by a particular culture, and contrast that with, let's say, in China, with women having, quote, bound feet, unquote, right? And feel free to research this further, about Chinese women of the upper classes used to bind their feet as a sign of beauty, right, through their whole childhood into their adult lives, because it was considered attractive, okay? Us, in our world, we probably most likely would not consider it, quote, attractive, right? That's because we live in the West, right? Okay, so again, that's another example of performance, right? Wearing makeup, playing football for men, right? Or sports, objectifying women is another way, right, that it's done. So again, you have this constant repetition of gendered behavior, right? To the point where these roles, these actions, decorum, to use our word, become normalized. And eventually they are seen as natural rather than created, right? Notions of, quote, manhood or womanhood. This is what makes gender real, just like, in race, black and white is seen as real, okay? Now, ultimately, such performativity and repetition results in what I just described, basically. The conception of gender in binary terms. That is to say, the naturalization and normalization of two genders, right? Gender binarism. Now, obviously, if you go to India, this may not make sense, right? Gender binarism. But for us, we assume it's just natural, the natural way to think about gender. Okay, so this is what results from the social construction of gender identity and gender roles, right? If you look back in history, just as notions of race have changed constantly, for example, remember the one drop rule and everything like that, so too can you discern gender ideology as constantly changing, gender behavior, gender roles. There's constant change in history, even in a particular and specific culture, like, let's say, American culture, right? You see changes in the past. Like I mentioned with, for example, color corresponding to, gender, like blue and pink. For example, at one point, let's say in the 19th century, as I mentioned, pink was assigned to baby boys, okay, thought to be more masculine. Blue was thought to be softer. As I also mentioned, both sexes wore dresses, right? Also, during the 19th century, you see masculinity change. Interestingly enough, before the influx of many Southern Europeans coming over to work in the factories, this notion of manhood or masculinity, well, they used the term manhood back then, right? Manhood was understood in terms of the more upper classes of Victorian England, right? And an ideal man, in other words, was one who was high-minded, demonstrated restraint in his behavior, was respectable, right? It had much less to do with, let's say, your physique, right? Big muscles, right? But then historians note that with the influx of the working class necessary for, the labor in the factories, you see the influx as well of different gender roles and gender ideas and practices, right? And these new ethnic groups emphasize physicality. In fact, when you think about the physicality of factory work, it requires strength. Well, you can see how that becomes attached to the already practiced gender and gender repetition, to use our words, with that influx of the working class. So in other words, you have an interesting case where the working class practice of gender becomes standard, right, by the 20th century. It displaces the older Victorian idea of the ideal man being, restrained in emotion and high-minded. That becomes replaced by the 20th century with, physicality and strength and even, muscularity. Think about today when, the ideal man is muscular, right? Okay, so this shows how one gender practice is replaced by another.